In this video, I'm going to give you the CFO method for scaling ads profitably. So we're gonna cut through all of the noise, all of the emotions. We're gonna clear up all of the misbeliefs around ROAS, around your conversions, around your contribution margin and your fixed costs. And we're gonna make sure that by the end, you know exactly how to approach your ad account and your ad budget in order to scale this the right way. I'm gonna bring in real examples from our client base where we now oversee over $100 million in revenue as a CFO firm. And this includes the ecom brands that are scaling themselves through ads. This includes agencies who are managing hundreds of millions of ad spend for their clients. And this includes businesses who are using ads in order to get clients or make sales for themselves. We're going to specifically look at a scenario where your ROAS dropped or your conversions dropped. And what I'm going to show you is that in many cases, cutting your spend will only make it worse. So let's dive right into this, because this is how most brands and agencies I see react to a drop in their ROAS. We see a ROAS fall, maybe goes from 3x to 2.3x. So now the reaction is that they're gonna cut spend because they've decided that they have to be at a 3x ROAS. Now what you often see is that ROAS does recover at a lower spend because you can now target warmer traffic. But what many brands and agencies don't know is that in this scenario, they might still be losing because now you are a much smaller business because you're spending less, so you're making less. So even though this ratio got better, your conversions went up again, your business might still be losing money, or it just got worse from a P&L perspective. That is exactly what we're gonna cover here. So as we're going to cover, there are 4 numbers that should decide every spend decision. The first one is your contribution margin. So this is a classic e-commerce metric. If you're not an ecom brand, you can think of this more as like the profit after subtracting your variable cost. So the revenue minus your cost to deliver on this, minus most of your variable expenses, primarily your ad spend. And so another way to think of your contribution margin is that this is what is left to cover the second metric, your fixed costs. Because these fixed costs are there no matter what. Think payroll, software, rent, any fixed agency fees that you have. These do not care how your ads are performing. They are there no matter what, and you need to be able to cover them. Then, as we're thinking of spend decisions, there's 2 more important metrics. First is your cash balance, because you need to actually be able to afford an increase in ad spend if that is what you have to do. And the other one is your inventory. Again, for an ecom, this is literally the stock that you have or how quickly you can get it in order to make the sales and deliver on your purchases. If you are an agency or another service business, this is much more just, the ability for you to deliver. So this might be your team can be seen as inventory. Like, do you have the staff available to deliver your service? And so as we're going now deeper, these are the 4 metrics you have to keep in mind as we're thinking about our ad spend decisions. So I'm going to start here with a bigger example. On the left, we see a typical ecom P&L. So you have your revenue, then we subtract the product cost, which gives us usually our gross profit. Then we take off any of the other costs in order to deliver our full cost of goods sold, our shipping fees, fulfillment fees, any other fees we have here, which gives us now a contribution margin. So let's say this is 63% that we have left. And then we have to take off our ad spend. That's when we get our contribution margin 2, which is more of a variable profit essentially. Then we subtract our fixed costs and we end up with our net profit. Now there's already 2 interesting metrics that you can keep in mind here. First is your contribution break-even ROAS. Very simple, you just divide your contribution margin 1 by 1 and you get here the contribution break-even ROAS. And so at this point, you make 0 profit. And so you are going to be losing money here because you still have to pay your fixed cost. But it's an interesting metric to keep in mind because at least we know that if ROAS is above 1.59, at least we are able to generate some additional profit in order to repay some of our obligations. So this is the absolute floor where we know from here on upwards, we're making some money to pay our costs. The second number is your profit break even. You can calculate this as follows. It's 1 plus your fixed cost divided by your ad spend, which you then divide by your contribution margin 1. You can just put this in a calculator or in a spreadsheet. And what this will tell you is based on the number you have here for your ad spend and the number you have for your fixed cost and your contribution margin, what ROAS you need to have to break even. So this is a good metric to know, but as we're going to cover, this isn't everything, but it is still a very relevant metric to actually figure out, what is a good ROAS to be aiming for. So now we have all the information we need to know. We know which metrics we have to look at: our contribution margin, our fixed costs, our cash balance, and our inventory or ability to deliver. And we know how the P&L is set up. Now let's look at the important stuff. What we have to do when our ROAS gets worse. So when we approach a lower ROAS or when performance tanks. Here's a starting scenario. Let's say we're doing $1 million. Whether this is a month or a year, doesn't matter. We're making $1 million. We have our product cost, our shipping and fulfillment fees, just all of the costs to deliver. And so that gives us a gross profit of $630,000, which is our contribution margin 1. And in order to get this, we spend $333K on ads. So we get a contribution margin 2 of just under $300K. We have $160K in fixed cost, so we are nice and profitable here. We have a blended ROAS of 3x, and this is a healthy business. This is great. This is a good place to be, and this is what we want to manage towards. But as we know, ROAS is never a fixed number. It can change by the day, it will change by the month. If we make a mistake in the ad account, it can all of a sudden tank completely, and so this number will always move. And so now let's go to scenario 2. Maybe we hit a creative fatigue, and so our ROAS drops to 2.3x, but we keep everything else the same. And so now what we see is that our $333K in ad spend only gets us $760K in revenue. Because we sell less, we do have lower product costs and we have lower shipping and fulfillment fees. So this is tied to revenue, of course. So we end up with a contribution margin 1 of 480 minus our ad spend gives us 150K in contribution margin 2 minus the fixed cost means we made a loss. This is a very common scenario. We have many clients where we see this play out if we look on a weekly or monthly basis. It just happens that sometimes the ads don't perform as well, and now we have a loss-making month. You are never going to avoid this. But what you can control is how you react to this. Because the instinct here is to cut spend in order to increase profit. Because the story here is simple. It's like, if we spend a little bit less on ads, maybe even ROAS improved a little bit, we would have made a profit again. And so that is how almost everyone reacts. And this is why ROAS is such a dangerous metric. Because look at what can happen in a scenario like this. That is scenario 3, the instinct way. We cut ad spend down to 250K and we see ROAS recover slightly to 2.5x. But what happens to our bottom line? We have a bigger loss than we had before. And that is because of our fixed cost. So let's go through it. At 250K, 2.5x ROAS, we make 625K. So we are a smaller business. We have less revenue. Because of that, product costs, shipping, fulfillment fees are also less because we just make less money. We now end with a contribution margin just under 400K. We had 250K in ad spend, and we end up with only 144K in contribution margin 2. And so as we see, the margin here is 23%. Whereas in this example, our margin was just under 20%. And so a lot of ad agencies, a lot of brands will think that this was a good move because our margin went up. We have a higher profit margin is essentially what you can see here. But what they don't look at, and this is especially hard for agencies because they often don't have visibility on the P&L, they don't see that these fixed costs are still there. No one cuts fixed costs. You can't just immediately fire your staff for one bad month of ad spend. But now what you get is that even though you had a higher margin, you're still losing money because you're not making enough to cover your fixed costs. So we have a higher ROAS and a worse business. And so what might have been a better move in this scenario is to increase ad spend, even if that tanks or lowers the ROAS further. And so let's take a look at this example. We're spending 420K on ads. ROAS goes down at 2.2 even. But because we spend a lot more, we do still make a lot more. So now we make 920K. And we have a lot more product costs, a lot more shipping and fulfillment fees, but also just a bigger dollar amount of contribution margin 1. We take off our largest share of ad spend and we end up with a contribution margin 2 of 162K. take away the fixed cost, and we are at least break even or like slightly profitable. So in this example, all these amounts are pretty close to each other. But if you take a much bigger business, maybe you're already going to 8 figures, 9 figures, then these decisions can literally swing the bottom line by tens, if not hundreds of thousands. And if you add these up on a monthly basis, it can be the difference between having a loss-making year or a profitable year. Plus, what this does is buy time. Because of course, this won't be sustainable to keep the 2.2x ROAS. But now at least we have some time, we're not losing money, and we can try and fix our creative or fix the issues we had or wait it out until ROAS picks up again. So with this example, what I want to highlight is that we don't always lower ad spend, but we actually take a more holistic look at the business, at the entire P&L, in order to decide whether we should actually scale up so that we can cover our fixed cost with some more margin. Because that is exactly the game we're trying to play. In our baseline, we had a beautiful business, but then when ROAS dropped, all of a sudden we started to make a loss. Then if we cut spend further, we're not just reducing the size of our business, probably failing to hit our goals, but we're also in a position where we even make a bigger loss due to our fixed costs. And so often the better move in the short term is to raise spend in order to cover our fixed costs. But this wouldn't be a CFO method if we left it there. Because while this strategy can work on the P&L perspective, we can absolutely hurt the business if we don't take a holistic look at also the balance sheet. And that's what we can see here. Because while we indeed had a better bottom line in the upside scenario, it does also mean that cash has to go out first. Because if we're spending more on ads, we do need to have the money to actually fund the ad account. If we're already tight on cash, we can't just spend more on ads if there's no buffer. On top of that, increasing the ad spend to sell more also means that we need more inventory. And this usually requires a payment up front. And so now there's this double negative impact on cash where we have more ad spend and we have more inventory that needs to be purchased, where there's usually even up to 48 days between like making the payment and having sold it and received the cash again. Sometimes this can even be longer for some of our clients. And so what we see here is that we have, in the upside case, an additional 125K of cash being committed before even any product is sold. And there is one additional risk that needs to be factored in, and that is that ROAS will fall even further with an increase in ad spend. Because we already had the ROAS go from 3 to 2.3. Now we assume if we increase spend a bit, it might fall to 2.2. But what if it falls to 1.9? And that's what we see here, that if that happens, our performance and our profit won't just be break even anymore. We will actually have a bigger loss. And so there is a real risk here that needs to be considered, that if we are not confident in our ad performance at all, and we are very tight on cash already, it might, in that case, be better to accept that smaller loss of cutting ad spend, because the risk is much lower, than it would be to take this risk of having increased spend, having increased inventory order, and having a potentially negative impact if ROAS tanks a lot further. And so this is not just a simple rule that you can always follow. This requires careful planning, and this is why smart people are still required in these decisions. Now, I'll give you one way that you can actually simplify this process, and that is with a 13-week cash flow forecast, and specifically one that bakes in multiple scenarios. So here, the visual shows you exactly how this works, but there's still a process to make this work, and that is with a 13-week cash flow forecast. This is something that any ecom brand must have, and I even recommend it to most agencies if they are scaling aggressively. Now, what we see here is a simplified overview of different scenarios that can play out when we make these decisions. So in your cash flow forecast, you need to bake in certain assumptions. You need to bake in how much cash you'll be collecting based on your planned ad spend and the planned ROAS. You need to bake in when your inventory purchases have to go out. Not when you receive it, not when you sell it, but when you have to pay your supplier. And you bake in, of course, all of your other costs, other revenue that you have, just everything that moves through your bank account. When that's set up, you only have to play around with certain assumptions. And it is now where we can visualize these different scenarios, where, for example, In a regular scenario 1, where we hold ROAS flat at 2.3x and we keep ad spend the same, we might see that yes, we'll be losing some money, but it is a lower risk. Then we can also create a second scenario of the increased ad spend. As you see there, you will have higher cash outflows in the start. We have more ad spend go out, we have our inventory orders go out. But if the assumption stays that ROAS is not going to completely tank, we will see that we, for instance, after 5 weeks, start to build up our cash buffer. And by the end of the 13 weeks, we might actually have more cash because we are not losing money long term. It requires an initial investment. And then, of course, we can make a stress test where we do increase spend and we have these inventory orders. But now we are not making more sales and ROAS does tank further. Now we can see exactly at which point we will actually go below our minimum cash reserve. And that's then what we can use to make this decision whether we want to take this risk, whether we see the likelihood to be higher that ROAS goes to 1.9x, or that we are able to maintain it at 2.2, or within 13 weeks if we expect this to go up again. Because that is, of course, the upside here, that ROAS does go up to 3x again, and we have the higher spend. And so now we will see our cash balance actually skyrocket. And so that is how I want you to think about scaling your ad account. And so if you understand this whole story of how your ad spend and your ad performance actually impacts your P&L and your balance sheet, then you know how to scale up an ad account like a CFO. And of course, if you have any questions about this or want an audit of your brand or your agency's P&L and balance sheet, then just book a call with me below, or you can send me a message on X or on Instagram. I'll talk to you there.